In September of 1987, 25-year-old Susan Daniels Smith stood in the corner of the living room inside of a house she rented in a small mountain town near the Kentucky-West Virginia border. People were talking loudly inside of this room, but Susan pretended not to be paying attention to what was going on around her. She lived in the small 4-room house with her 2 young kids and her ex-husband, Kenneth. And sharing a home with her ex-husband was bad enough, but recently, things had gotten a lot worse when he invited 2 of his friends to stay with them. They were a couple, and Susan knew they were dangerous. The man in the couple was known around town as Cat Eyes because he had piercing hazel blue eyes. And he was a hero to the petty criminals in the area because years ago, he had successfully robbed a bank and gotten away with over $300,000. And rumor had it, Cat Eyes had then gone out and blown all of that money on flashy cars and cocaine. Susan wanted nothing to do with Cat Eyes, and she definitely didn't want this man and his girlfriend anywhere near her kids. But she didn't try to kick them out of the house because she knew that would make her ex-husband Kenneth angry, and when Kenneth got angry, he could get violent. So, Susan stood there in the living room, staring off into space like she was in another world. But the whole time, she was really listening to Cat Eyes brag about his plan for his next big bank robbery. And as Susan listened, she decided Cat Eyes' plan was her ticket out of that small town and into a better life for her and her kids. Susan had spent years dreaming about getting out of the situation she was in. She'd been poor since she was born, and she had lived most of her life in an area of the Appalachian Mountains that was known for hosting an annual event called Hillbilly Days, and for being the home of a legendary feud between 2 famous families, the Hatfields and the McCoys. And so Susan just felt like everything around her, physically, emotionally, mentally, was trapped in the past. But she wanted a life that was new and modern, like the lives she saw people leading on TV and in movies. And she would spend hours at a time imagining what it would be like to go on an exciting adventure, or to fall in love with the perfect guy and move to a big house in the suburbs with a huge yard for her kids to play in. But Susan knew finding a new life like that would cost money, and she didn't even have enough money to rent a place of her own without her ex-husband. But now, standing in the living room, Susan believed Cat Eyes' next bank robbery could change her life for good. So while Cat Eyes dazzled his girlfriend and Kenneth with his latest plan, Susan slipped out of the living room and into the kitchen. She listened to make sure Cat Eyes was still talking, and then she placed a phone call. And when a man picked up on the other line, Susan spoke in a whisper, said a few words, and then hung up. Then she walked back into the living room and interrupted Cat Eyes to say she was going out for a jog but would not be gone for long, and she told Kenneth to keep an eye on their kids who were playing in another room. The group in the living room barely looked up at Susan, so she walked to the front door, stepped outside, and headed down the street towards the center of town. Susan was 5 foot 5 inches tall with short brown hair, and she wore cut-off jean shorts and a sleeveless shirt to show off her tan. The weather was warm, and she loved feeling the sun on her face, and even brief moments away from the chaos of her house made her feel like she was free. But as nice as it was outside, she reminded herself that this was not a leisurely walk. And as she thought about what she was on her way to do, she started getting nervous, and she felt like she had a pit in her stomach. Then, when she got to the center of town, Susan turned off from the main road onto a nearby deserted side street, and she saw an old Dodge sedan parked there. Susan glanced back and forth and looked over her shoulder, and when she was sure nobody was watching her, she walked down the street to the Dodge, opened the door, and slid into the passenger seat. Then she turned and said hello to the man sitting in the driver's seat. It was FBI agent Mark Putnam. Mark was only 28 years old, but he looked older in his dark suit and tie. And he had a confidence about him that made him seem like he'd been an FBI agent a lot longer than he actually had. Mark thanked Susan for meeting with him, and then asked what information she had that could help him. Mark had met Susan a month earlier when he had started working in the Pikeville, Kentucky FBI office, which was not far from where Susan lived. Coming to the small Kentucky town had been Mark's first major assignment at the bureau, and at the time, his wife had been shocked that Pikeville even had an FBI office. But Mark knew that region of Kentucky and West Virginia had long been a favorite spot for bank robbers, because the towns and surrounding hill country were dotted with small banks that carried significant amounts of cash, but didn't always have the same level of security that larger banks in bigger cities had. And so Mark had come to Pikeville primarily to crack down on bank robberies. and soon after his arrival, he had focused his attention on Cat Eyes. But to bring Cat Eyes down, Mark needed inside information. So he had reached out to local law enforcement to see if they could help him find a trustworthy informant, someone who would give him the information he needed to catch Cat Eyes in the act. And a sheriff's deputy had introduced Mark to Susan. Susan had dealt drugs in the past, and she had connections to criminals in the area, and most importantly to Mark, Susan knew Cat Eyes. But at first, the idea of becoming an FBI informant had horrified Susan, and she told Mark she would never rat out people she knew to the government, no matter what crime they committed. But then, Mark had explained the FBI would pay her good money if she provided them with useful information. And soon, after meeting Susan, Mark handed her $500 just to prove he was serious. And right then, Susan had realized that becoming an FBI informant was her best chance to start a new life for her and her kids. So, in the Dodge sedan, Susan shifted back and forth in the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and told Mark she was ready to start talking. And so Mark grabbed a pen and a small notebook from his pocket and listened. Then Susan told Mark that Cat Eyes and his girlfriend had been staying at her house, and she said Cat Eyes had been actively talking about the next big bank robbery he was planning. She said he never mentioned the exact bank, but she was sure it was one in the area. Mark said she was probably right, and then he asked her to give as many details as possible. So Susan relayed everything she'd heard Cat Eyes say in her living room. Mark wrote everything down and thanked her for talking to him. He said the information she provided could prove to be very valuable. And he told her if the information turned out to be true, the FBI would pay her $1,500, which by today's standards in 2023 would be worth about $4,000. A huge smile crossed Susan's face. That kind of money could go a long way to helping her and her kids. And she knew if she was right about this bank robbery, the FBI would probably want to keep using her as an informant so she could keep earning money by talking. Then Mark reminded Susan to just act normal when she got back home and to not talk about the bank robbery at all. Susan said she understood, then she looked around to make sure nobody was close by, and she stepped back out of the car. Once she was outside, she put her head down and walked as fast as she could back to her house. When she got home, everybody, Cat Eyes included, was still talking in the living room, and they barely even noticed she'd been gone. Susan let out a sigh of relief and went to check on her kids in the other room. And she told herself she just had to play it cool for a few days and then everything would be fine. And then on September 10th, just a couple of days after Susan had met with Mark, Cat Eyes robbed a bank in Pikeville, Kentucky, and got away with thousands of dollars. But because of Susan's information, the FBI had been prepared, and so banks throughout the area had used dye packets to stain the cash in their vaults. And so a week later, when Cat Eyes tried to exchange the dye-stained bills he'd stolen for clean bills at another bank, the bank teller immediately called the FBI on Cat Eyes, and the FBI tracked him down. The information Susan had provided Mark had led directly to Cat Eyes' arrest, and so Susan got her $1,500 and proved she was an informant the FBI could trust. And for the first time, Susan started to believe she really could change her life, and that her dreams of having a big house and a safe, quiet neighborhood were about to come true. In the months following Cat Eyes' arrest, Susan kept in contact with FBI agent Mark Putnam, and the FBI believed that because Susan had dealt drugs in the past, she might be able to help them with drug trafficking cases that reached as far west as Chicago. Susan was excited at the prospect of helping them with these cases, and she felt like working as an informant for the FBI was the closest thing to being a character in an action movie she could possibly imagine. But then, in early 1988, about 4 months after Cat Eyes got caught, Mark told Susan the FBI needed her to testify against Cat Eyes in court. But the thought of appearing in court terrified Susan. She said secretly passing along information to the FBI was one thing, but testifying out in public was too much. She was afraid if she helped send Cat Eyes to prison publicly, well, his friends and family might try to take revenge on her. But Mark said if she agreed to testify, the FBI would pay her $4,000, which by today's standards in 2023 would be over $10,000. And that was just too much money for Susan to turn down. So about a month later, she took the stand in court and testified against Cat Eyes. And it turned out that Susan was a very strong witness for the government, and her testimony really helped put him behind bars. And after the court case, Susan continued to work as an FBI informant, and she even gave them information that helped them bust Cat Eyes' uncle for another bank robbery. Susan was really excited that the FBI believed in her and that she had even more money coming in, but people around Susan were starting to catch on to her new job. Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, knew she had testified against his friend Cat Eyes, and now he suspected Susan was still working as a government rat, and he said he was disgusted that she would sell out people she knew to a bunch of FBI agents, and so he grew increasingly angry and violent towards her. And Susan was afraid of Kenneth, and she was scared that having testified in court had now put her in danger just like she said it would. And so by the fall of 1988, about a year after Cat Eyes was arrested, Susan was living in almost constant fear that someone was going to kill her. And to deal with that fear and paranoia and stress, she had started drinking heavily and doing cocaine. Then, on a night in May of 1989, over a year after she had testified against Cat Eyes, Susan was throwing back a few drinks at a local bar. The music was loud, Susan was laughing with her friends, and she could hear the sound of pool balls crashing against each other from the pool tables at the back of the bar. And at least for a few minutes, Susan forgot about all the problems in her life. When she was done drinking, she paid her bill, and she and her friends stumbled outside into the night air. But as she walked down the street, Susan heard someone shout her name from behind her. She stopped, lurched forward on her feet a little, and then turned around. Her balance was off and her vision was fuzzy from the alcohol, but she saw the woman who had called her name. It was Cat Eyes' girlfriend, the same one who had been at Susan's house for a time. And before Susan could do anything, the woman was running right at her. Cat Eyes' girlfriend screamed, lunged at Susan, and slammed her to the ground. Then she got on top of Susan and began pounding on her with her fist. Susan tried to get the woman off of her, but she couldn't, and then she felt a sharp pain in her back from where she'd fallen on the hard concrete, and her head throbbed with every hit she took. Finally, Susan's friends who saw this happening ran over and managed to break up the fight, but Susan just stayed on the ground, trying not to show how upset and scared she was. Cat Eyes' girlfriend started to walk off, but she stopped, turned around, and told Susan she would find her again soon, and next time she would kill her. In the days following the fight with Cat Eyes' girlfriend, Susan's fear and paranoia got much, much worse. Every time she left her house, she was convinced she was being followed, and at home, she got jumpy whenever the phone rang, so she didn't feel safe anywhere. And she knew she couldn't keep living like that, so she turned to the FBI for help. But Agent Mark Putnam, who Susan had trusted and worked closely with, had transferred months earlier to the FBI branch in Miami, Florida. But during his time working with Susan, Mark had introduced her to another agent who he trusted, and Susan had worked with that agent as an informant as well. So Susan called that FBI agent and told him about everything that was happening in her life. The agent was concerned and he wanted to help, so he booked her a room at a motel in Pikeville, not far from the FBI offices. Susan was worried about being away from her kids for too long, but despite the ongoing huge issues she was having with her ex-husband Kenneth, he had moved into his own place and had been taking care of the kids far more often since Susan's life had started falling apart. So Susan felt like even if she went away for a little while, the kids would be looked after. And so Susan accepted the offer from the FBI agent and went to stay at the motel. A few days later, at 10:30 p.m. on June 8, 1989, Susan was standing outside her second-floor motel room smoking a cigarette. She wore gray gym shorts and a t-shirt. With the moon glowing bright in the sky, Susan stared at the outline of mountain peaks on the horizon. The view was beautiful, but it made Susan sad, because not that long ago, she had believed she was finally going to move somewhere else new with her kids to start a better life. But now, at only 27 years old, things seemed like they just kept getting worse for her, and Susan was losing hope that she would ever escape this place. Just then, Susan heard a car pull into the parking lot down below. She leaned over the second-floor railing to get a better look, and she saw the car was a Ford Tempo, and immediately she felt her pulse quicken because she recognized that car. Susan stepped back from the railing but kept an eye on the parking lot. Then she saw the driver step out and go into a room on the first floor. Susan stood there for a minute trying to decide what to do, but then she flicked her cigarette to the ground and rushed down the outside stairwell towards the front door of the room the driver had just gone into. When she got to that room, Susan started banging on the door. The door eventually opened, and immediately Susan just rushed past the driver inside. And as soon as Susan was inside, the driver slammed the door in frustration behind her. Then, just a few minutes later, the door opened again, and the driver and Susan rushed through the parking lot together, and they both got into the Ford Tempo car. Then, the driver started the engine, hit the gas, sped away from the motel, and they turned onto a dark mountain road. On the morning of June 16, 1989, 8 days after Susan and the driver of the Ford Tempo had left the motel, Detective Richard Ray of the Kentucky State Police sat down at his desk in the state police offices in Pikeville. Ray was 54 years old, and he had recently started thinking about retirement. He was the most experienced detective working out of the Pikeville office, and he'd started to get tired of all the bureaucracy he felt like he was always running up against in the department. But Ray didn't let his thoughts of retirement keep him from doing his job. And his bosses knew that whenever there was a particularly tough case in the area, Ray was the man they wanted leading the investigation. Ray took a sip of coffee and saw a handwritten note addressed to him on his desk. He picked up the note and quickly read it over. The note was a request from his boss for Ray to look into a new missing persons case. So Ray took another sip of coffee, put his mug down, and walked across the station to talk to the officer who'd taken the missing persons call. And the officer told Ray the missing person in question was a woman named Susan Daniel Smith, and that her sister had called in after not seeing or hearing from Susan for several days. Ray nodded and said he'd get right on it. He had worked in the area long enough to know who Susan was, and that she had been working as an FBI informant, and Detective Ray also knew that that meant she could be in real danger. So he headed out of the office and drove to the nearby town where Susan's sister lived. And when Ray arrived at her house, Susan's sister led him inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Detective Ray was a man of few words, but when he did speak, he had a warm, reassuring voice. And he told Susan's sister he was going to do everything he could to help. And she told Ray that Susan had mentioned she was going to stay at a motel in Pikeville for a few days, and that after that she might go to Chicago with some friends. When Ray heard this, his first thought was that Susan might have actually gone out of town just to help the FBI with something. But he kept that to himself, and he asked if it was possible Susan had just extended her trip for a few days. But Susan's sister said that Susan would never do something like that without calling, or at least without checking in on her kids. And Susan's sister knew that Susan's kids had not heard from their mom in over a week. Ray said it was good that she had called it in, and then a serious look came across his face, and his voice got even quieter. And he asked Susan's sister if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Susan. And without missing a beat, she said Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, was a violent man. Detective Ray thanked Susan's sister for her time and said he would keep her informed when he learned more. Then Ray walked back through the house, stepped outside, and got into his car. Ray knew Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, had dealt drugs in the area for years, and that he was a friend of Cat Eyes, the bank robber Susan had helped put away. But before Ray could track down Kenneth, he knew he had to check in with the FBI. The missing person was one of their informants, and he had to make sure his investigation was not going to interfere with something they were working on with Susan. So, later that day, when Ray got back to the station, he reached out to the FBI. The relationship between the FBI and the state police in Pikeville was not always the best. FBI agents, especially young ones, often clashed with state troopers when working cases together, and there seemed to be a level of distrust from both sides. But Detective Ray had worked closely with several FBI agents in the area, and he knew they were committed to their jobs just like he was. And even if he didn't always see eye to eye with them, he knew they generally shared the same goal as him, to keep the people in the area safe. So, Ray spoke to the FBI agent who had recently begun working with Susan, and when the agent heard Susan was missing, he got very concerned. He told Ray that she had been given a room at a local motel, but it was his understanding that she had left town and gone to Chicago. Ray and the agent talked a little bit longer, and then they agreed to keep in touch and let the other one know if they discovered anything new. And so after touching base with the FBI, Ray contacted Susan's friends and family to see if any of them had information that could help him. And after talking to Susan's friends, it didn't take long for Ray to start hearing more about Kenneth, her ex-husband, as well as a few other people around town who apparently had a personal grudge against Susan. In the following weeks, Detective Ray thought he had at least 2 legitimate suspects who he believed could have something to do with Susan's disappearance: her ex-husband, Kenneth, and Cat Eyes' girlfriend. But while trying to pursue those leads, Ray suddenly ran into a lot of the issues at his job that had started to frustrate him and make him think about retiring. Ray discovered that as far as state police leadership and the FBI were concerned, Ray had no proof that any crime had actually been committed. Susan's body had not been found, and there was no evidence that any violence had taken place at the motel where she had been staying, or at the homes of her ex-husband, her sister, or any of her friends. And so as Ray tried to argue his case for bringing in suspects for questioning, he was continually told that the missing person, Susan Daniel Smith, had a history of using and dealing drugs, and that there was a good chance that she had just left town to deal or use drugs in a place where she wasn't so well known. Ray felt like he'd run up against a bureaucratic brick wall, and that his investigation was stalling before it really even got started. And his job only got harder when he was quickly assigned to other cases, and anything involving Susan got put on the back burner. But as he moved on to these other cases, Ray refused to put Susan's case completely aside, and he made time, even if it was just for a few hours a week, to keep his search for Susan going. Because he believed that even if this young woman had made some questionable choices in her life, she still deserved to be found and protected. And so for months, Susan remained missing, and Ray continued to put pressure on his superiors to let him pursue the people he believed could be responsible for Susan's disappearance. And finally, in January of 1990, 7 months after Susan was last seen, Ray was allowed to bring Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, in for questioning and a polygraph, or what some people call a lie detector test. On a cool winter day, months into the investigation, Ray led Kenneth into a small interrogation room at the state police department in Pikeville, and they sat down across from each other at a table. Kenneth was tall and handsome with long brown hair, and he wore jeans, a t-shirt, and cowboy boots that he tapped on the floor while he talked. Since Susan's disappearance, Kenneth had been taking care of their kids on his own, and he told Ray that he was trying really hard to clean up his act and become a better father. He said he'd gotten a job and that he'd kicked using drugs of any kind. But despite Kenneth's claims, his hands were jittery, and he was talking so fast that Ray wondered if the man was high right there in the interrogation room. But then, Detective Ray asked Kenneth if he knew where Susan was, and Ray's sense of calm seemed to immediately rub off on Kenneth, and so Kenneth, he took a breath, and then clearly laid out a timeline of when he had last seen and spoken to his ex-wife. He said Susan had stayed with him and the kids at his new place for a night back in June, right before she was planning to leave town, but then she never called or showed up again. Detective Ray nodded, and then he asked Kenneth about past arguments and physical altercations he had had with Susan. And Kenneth said he knew he had been a terrible husband and a terrible father in the past, but as Kenneth leaned across the table and looked right at Detective Ray, he said he had nothing to do with Susan going missing. And by the end of their discussion, while Ray was not willing to rule Kenneth out as a suspect, he was inclined to believe that Kenneth truly didn't know what had happened to Susan. And the polygraph that Kenneth willingly took proved to be inconclusive. So Detective Ray knew he had to keep looking for answers elsewhere, and that meant he would have to convince his superiors to give him the time and resources to go after other suspects. But not long after he met with Kenneth, Ray was preparing to make his case to his superiors that he needed more time and support when he got a call from Susan's sister. And when Ray asked her if everything was okay, she started laughing on the other line, and she said he could stop searching for Susan. Ray shook his head like he must have misunderstood her, and then he asked her what she meant. And Susan's sister told him that one of their cousins had gotten in touch to say she'd recently spoken to Susan on the phone, and so Susan must be okay. Ray really wanted to believe Susan was somewhere safe and sound, and that she had made that phone call, but he had to follow up on it to be sure. So he took down the name and address of this cousin, thanked Susan's sister for letting him know, and then he headed out of the station with the hope that he might actually find Susan. In mid-January, 7 months after Susan's disappearance, Detective Ray sped down a country road outside of Pikeville. And after driving for several miles, he turned onto a dirt road, and then a few minutes later, he arrived at a small trailer home. Ray parked his car and stepped out into the cool winter air. Then he walked through the overgrown grass towards the front of the trailer, and he saw the door was open. But before he could say anything, he heard a woman shout from inside, and he heard footsteps cutting across the trailer. And then the woman appeared in the doorway with the barrel of a shotgun pointed right at Ray. Ray put his hands up, introduced himself, and reassured the woman he was only there to help find her cousin Susan. The woman looked Ray over and then lowered the gun. Susan's cousin was 52 years old, but she looked way older than that to Ray. And even though she'd put her weapon down, she still stared at him like she didn't trust him. So in his very calm voice, Ray asked her about the phone conversation she'd had with Susan. But Susan's cousin suddenly had a strange look come over her face, like she was trying to remember something from a long, long time ago. And so Ray asked her if everything was okay, and she looked right at him and said she wasn't convinced anymore that the woman who had called her actually was Susan. She said she might have been on some prescription pills at the time that made her a little loopy and confused, and so maybe that's why she thought it was Susan when really it wasn't. And then she leaned in close to Ray and said that she thought someone might have been playing a prank on her. Ray smiled and thanked her for the help, then he turned and walked back to his car. The truth was, he had no idea what to make of this. He could easily believe this woman had mistaken another caller for her missing cousin, and he was sorry to admit it, but he also believed there were people in town who were cruel enough to play a prank like that on a lonely woman like her. So by the time Ray got back to the station, he was feeling desperate. It had taken months for him to get the okay to question Susan's ex-husband, and now his hope that Susan had contacted a family member had disappeared in one quick conversation with the cousin, and Ray knew he didn't have the support to just keep pursuing this case for as long as he wanted. But he was not willing to give up yet, and he still believed he could find Susan. So he went back to the one group he thought might be able to help him, the FBI. And finally, after months of his investigation, Ray had a face-to-face meeting with an FBI agent that would help shed new light on the case. And soon after that meeting, Detective Ray and members of the FBI would have a clear picture of what happened that night at the motel, and they would find Susan. Based on the information from Ray's face-to-face meeting with the FBI agent and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the night Susan disappeared, June 8, 1989. On June 8, 1989, at 10:30 p.m., the Ford Tempo pulled into the motel parking lot. The driver stepped out of the car and glanced up at the second floor. The driver saw Susan standing there in gray shorts and a t-shirt, but the driver just put their head down and tried to move fast enough so Susan would not see them. Then the driver headed into a room on the first floor, closed the door behind them, and sat down on the bed. But only a few minutes later, the driver heard someone pounding on the door. They knew it had to be Susan, so they took a deep breath, got up, and opened the door. And as soon as the door opened, Susan barged in and started screaming and yelling. The driver shut the door behind her and tried to calm Susan down, but she wasn't calming down. She just kept on yelling. The driver knew the motel walls were thin, and they didn't want to draw any attention to themselves, so they grabbed Susan by the hand, led her out of the room, into the parking lot, and over to their car, the Ford Tempo. They both got inside, Susan kept yelling, and the driver just immediately fired up the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and they made their way out onto a dark mountain road. But as they drove, Susan just continued to yell, and the driver struggled to concentrate on the narrow, winding road, so they eventually found a clearing to pull into, and they parked the car. But once the car was stopped, Susan just got louder and louder. She was angry, and she was saying things that didn't make any sense, and so the driver finally snapped at her and told her to be quiet, but she just kept going. The driver tried to interject and to make her listen, but Susan didn't want to hear anything they had to say. And soon, all of Susan's words started to blend together, and the driver could feel a sharp pain starting behind their eyes, and they really wanted Susan to just stop talking. So finally, the driver slammed their hands down on the dashboard and then lunged across the car at Susan. The driver wrapped their hands around Susan's throat and started squeezing as hard as they could. Susan thrashed her arms and tried to break free, but the driver squeezed Susan's throat even tighter. Then Susan kicked her feet wildly and she cracked the windshield with her shoe, but the driver did not let go. They tightened their grip and watched Susan's face turn red as she spit and gasped for air. And then finally, Susan's legs and arms went limp. The driver released their grip on Susan and her body slumped over in the passenger seat. Then the driver looked down at their hands and they were shaking, and they saw there was a cut on one of them, and they looked at Susan's body and the cracked windshield, and suddenly the car felt like it was spinning. So the driver took a breath and tried to keep themselves calm. Then the driver glanced outside to make sure no cars were on the nearby road. And when they were sure they were alone in this clearing, they got out of the car, went around to the passenger side, opened the door, and pulled Susan's body out onto the ground. Then the driver stripped Susan out of her shorts and shirt and carried the clothes around to the back of the car. They popped open the trunk, tossed the clothes in, and then went back to Susan's body. The driver crouched down, picked Susan up, and then threw her into the trunk as well. Then they got back into the car, pulled out onto the mountain road, and headed back towards the motel. At the motel, the driver showered, bandaged their cut hand, and stayed awake all night. Then, on the following morning, they drove to a meeting with Susan's body still in the trunk of their car, and later that night, they got rid of Susan's clothes in a trash can, and then they drove the Ford Tempo down a series of mountain roads that led past an old coal mine to a dense wooded ravine. There, the driver parked the car, went around to the trunk, pulled out Susan's body, and laid it down in the ravine beneath a pile of weeds and underbrush. Then the driver left the ravine, got back inside of their Ford Tempo, and headed back to the motel. And the following week, they flew to Miami and headed home to see their wife and kids before going into work at the offices of the FBI. FBI agent Mark Putnam, the man who had first recruited Susan as an informant, had strangled Susan to death and left her body in the middle of nowhere. It turned out Mark and Susan had been having a secret affair while she was working for him as an informant. But when Mark had left for Miami, Susan felt completely used and discarded, and when she tried to call Mark, he had pushed her away. But then, in June of 1989, Mark had to return to Pikeville to help wrap up a case he'd worked on while he was there. And it turned out the other FBI agent Susan had worked with knew about her and Mark's relationship. And so when Susan had reached out to that agent for help after Cat Eyes' girlfriend attacked her, she told the agent she was pregnant with Mark's child. And the agent believed Susan had the right to confront Mark about the baby, so he told her that Mark was coming back to town, and he booked her a room at the motel where Mark would be staying. So then, on the night of June 8th, wearing gray gym shorts and a t-shirt that belonged to Mark, Susan had waited for him to pull into the parking lot and go to his room. And when Mark went into his room, Susan followed him inside. And she said she was going to tell Mark's wife and his superiors at the FBI that he had slept with one of his informants and gotten her pregnant, and that's when Mark had pulled her out of the room and taken her to the car, and after they had parked in that clearing and continued to argue, Mark finally grabbed Susan and strangled her to death. It would turn out Detective Ray had actually suspected Mark from the beginning, but investigating an FBI agent for possible homicide was extremely difficult and complicated. But when Ray had finally gotten the FBI to set up an interview, Mark denied he had had an affair with Susan and said she had made the story up about her being pregnant, and he said he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Susan's claim that she was pregnant with Mark's child would never be confirmed, but that interview with Mark still led authorities to a piece of incriminating evidence. Mark had rented the Ford Tempo through the FBI when he went back to Pikeville. But he had returned the Tempo early and rented another car. And the rental car company had noted that the Tempo had a badly cracked windshield. And when Mark was confronted about the cracked windshield by investigators, he struggled to come up with a viable excuse for it. And after that, Mark panicked, and his version of events quickly started to fall apart, and he eventually admitted to having an affair with Susan, and then he confessed to killing her. It was the first time in history that an FBI agent would be convicted of murder. But Mark still had one move he could make that could save him from life in prison. He said in exchange for a more lenient sentence, he would tell Detective Ray, state police, and the FBI where he had left Susan's body. Mark signed a plea deal and gave law enforcement the location of Susan's body, and on June 5, 1990, almost exactly a year after Mark had killed Susan, Susan's remains were located and retrieved. And soon after, Susan's family was able to bury her in a private funeral. As part of his deal, Mark pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But he was released from prison after serving only 10 years and 3 months. As of 2023, he was living in Georgia and working as a personal trainer. John Jones and his family were avid spelunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave. which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, enter Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to the section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decide to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the birth canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal, and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just got to go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again and his chest expands and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip. Because he's now moved past it, he can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck. And from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's going to go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time, everything's going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is going to take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is going to take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200 pound man out of this tiny space, that's going to take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. Didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. So they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called Panic. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen. And when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth, but you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just gotta have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead-end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go. And they go pretty far out, but if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen, he'll probably get hypercapnia, he won't be able to get to the surface, and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't, and he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive. And they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly, those 3 divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface, and he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other 2 had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, They're relying on a flashlight for light. There's 2 dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through. And push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital. They would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called The Third Stage. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on, but as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse fell in the first place, and so he looked down to see if maybe it tripped on something, and he saw on the ground right beneath the horse was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way, and then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across, but when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look, and when his eyes adjusted, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of clear water. The horse had just stepped into the roof of an underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was, and so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole, he puts the weight into the hole, and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, it just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet. And so the farmer is like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom, but in reality it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, called the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this hole in the middle of this field that this horse created, and it's literally a shaft that goes down 18 feet until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they put it on while they're treading water. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet when he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave, what he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a rock pile that sits at the bottom in the middle of this huge underwater cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions, but once you get to the bottom, there's only 2 tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle, that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that's much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that have explored the deepest recesses of this cave say there are 3 distinct stages to it. Stage 1 is from the surface down to 120 feet, the top of the rock pile. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole. It's a very easy section of the cave. And there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile. so you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels, and as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the limestone silt off of the walls. It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in fog where a flashlight can't push through it. And so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb, and if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface, or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down, and to get to the surface, they will swim straight down until it's too late and they can't get back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the 200-foot mark of the easterly cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage is unbelievably dangerous. As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the 3rd stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false domes. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this 3rd stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it'd be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false. They are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the 1st and 2nd stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the 3rd stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the 3rd stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had dove in a cave. And so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the 3rd stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of jamming their bottle with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need since they were going into stage 2, and so that's a requirement, instead of doing that, they just jammed their bottles with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all jocked up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile, and there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19 respectively. And Glenn remembers after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. Everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns, kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not emergency situation, but it was time to leave. And everybody else had the same amount of air as he did. And so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3. But when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black and it was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what, I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out and they're just going to go down a little ways and they'll come back up again. And so I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden 3rd stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limit section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this 3rd stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized, this is a terrible idea, we need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet, was completely silted out. And so Larry is in the back of this return trip line, and right in front of him is Christine. And so as soon as they all make their way into the silt, the only thing Larry can see with his flashlight is Christine's fins. And so he's staying right up on her and keeping his light on that fin to make sure he's going in the right direction. And so after only a few moments, Christine's fins just suddenly disappear. And so Larry's thinking, I don't know where she went, but I don't have enough time. I have almost no air. And so he just keeps on swimming, believing he's going the right way. And sure enough, he clears out of the silt and he goes up and back over the drop-off ledge. And he shines his light back up the eastern tunnel, back up towards the rock pile, expecting to see Christine and the other divers he was just with. But he's looking and there's no one there. There's no silt, it's totally clear, and there's not one diver in front of him. So he looks at his gauge again and he's got a little bit of air, enough to maybe go down and make sure nobody is still down there. Because he's thinking, I don't think it's possible they could have swam all the way through this tunnel in this space of time. So he turns around, he goes back over the drop-off ledge, back into the silt, and as he's moving very slowly and cautiously, up ahead he sees flashlights moving around on the ceiling of the tunnel. And so he moves down towards this flashing light, and he realizes the light is coming from inside of a false dome right above him. And so he looks up and he saw there was Christine and another man named Roberts, who was 28, frantically swimming around, shining their lights, looking for the way out, not realizing they're in this dead end. And so Larry was about to shine his light to get their attention when Larry's flashlight went out. And so now Larry is in complete darkness. He is completely silted out. He doesn't even know how much air he has left because he can't shine the light on it. And so he's starting to panic. He starts banging on his flashlight, and finally the light comes back on. And when it does, he shines it straight up again to try to shine it towards Christine and Roberts, but he had drifted farther down the tunnel. And so by the time he shined his light, he wasn't underneath the false dome. But when he shined his light in the other direction, he saw he was at the very far end of where the group had gone, and so farther down into stage 3 was clear. There was no silt. And so he shined his light down into the stage 3 tunnel, and way down the tunnel, barely visible, he sees there is one diver with his flashlight out swimming the wrong direction down into oblivion. His name was John, he was 20 years old, and he almost certainly had nitrogen narcosis. Larry knew he could not save him, and so Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Roberts. But he's not finding it, and he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low, and he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's gonna die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt, he goes up and over the drop-off ledge, he gets to the rock pile, he grabs the safety line, and he fins himself up to the surface, and when he gets to the surface, he looks around, and there's only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked, and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in, he turned around, and he dove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members, that his friends are going to come out of there. But as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one was coming out of that tunnel. And so finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around. And on that return trip back to the surface, he realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcropping. Glenn's 22-year-old brother Stephen was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister Christine and the 28-year-old man Roberts that she was with inside of the false dome were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believe when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit, and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, they floated down and out of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen it. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at the border between New York State and Ontario, Canada. And as he looked out at the dozens of cars lined up at his checkpoint, he felt an enormous amount of responsibility. Because for him, working at border security was not just about checking people's passports. It was also about making sure dangerous criminals from the United States did not flee their country and enter Canada. And today, there was one particular dangerous criminal from the United States that this guard was on high alert for: a 30-year-old man named Alex Mangle. A few days earlier, Alex Mangle had been stopped by a police officer near New York City. And during this traffic stop, Alex had somehow taken the police officer's gun and shot the officer in the head, killing them, and then Alex had fled, and he was still on the run. And so now law enforcement was concerned that because New York was only 6 hours from the Canadian border, that it was very possible that Alex might try to flee into Canada to escape persecution. And so US and Canadian law enforcement and border security were on the lookout for Alex Mangle. And he was this 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And so all day long, that Canadian border security guard looked very closely at every person who came through his checkpoint to see if they were Alex Mangle. He would see a family on their way to visit relatives in Canada. He would see a couple on their honeymoon. He would see a man with a car full of camping supplies and a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and all these different people from all walks of life, but none of them looked anything like Alex Mangle. And so by the end of his shift, after checking dozens and dozens of cars and looking at every person, he felt certain that Alex Mangle had not slipped through his checkpoint. And so he clocked out and he went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was patrolling this parking lot right outside of a shopping mall in Ontario, Canada, which was located about an hour and a half away from the border. And during his patrol, at some point, he noticed there was this one car, a white Toyota, that had been loitering in the area for quite a while. And so he decided to drive over and see what was going on. And when he got there, he looked inside the vehicle and he saw someone sitting on the passenger seat. And he was a white man, probably in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And this officer immediately recognized this guy as being the wanted criminal, Alex Mangle. And so the officer immediately called for backup, and then he parked his car, got out, and approached the white Toyota where this guy was sitting with his gun drawn. And as the officer approached the passenger side door, the man inside turned, noticed the officer, jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the car, and the Toyota sped out of the parking lot. And so the officer, he jumps back in his cruiser and he takes off after him. And before long, it was like the entirety of the police force in Toronto was a part of this high-speed chase to catch this guy. And eventually they funneled the car into a dead-end street, and the white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and then the man inside with the mustache and the thinning brown hair pops out, and immediately everybody sees, yep, that's Alex Mangle. He didn't put up a fight at that point. He was taken into custody. However, despite how relieved law enforcement was to have this cop killer in custody, they realized they didn't understand something. How was it that Alex Mangle got past border security and got into Canada? Everybody was on high alert looking for him. What happened? And so police were baffled until they searched that white Toyota Alex had been driving. On the night that Alex shot and killed that police officer near New York City, he immediately fled to this wooded area and hid out overnight. And then the next day when he got up, he was walking around and he happened to pass by this commercial building. And as he was looking at it, he saw this middle-aged woman, whose name was Beverly Capone, come out of the building and make her way towards her car. And she was all alone. And so Alex walked up to her and abducted her at gunpoint, and then he drove her to this cabin out in the woods that he knew would be totally isolated, no one was there. And once they got there, he murdered her, and then once she was dead, he stole her clothes and put it on, and also cut off her face and her scalp and put those on as well. He was literally wearing her skin and hair. And he hopped in that white Toyota and he drove up to the Canadian border, and amazingly, he got through the checkpoint into Canada without anybody noticing. It would turn out that Canadian border security guard, who all day was checking for Alex Mangle, did actually see Alex Mangle. He just didn't recognize him because Alex Mangle was wearing Beverly Capone's face, hair, and clothes. And so he thought he was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he let him on through. And so police would figure this whole thing out when they searched that white Toyota, because they would find lying on the floorboard was Beverly's dress, scalp, and face. Alex was deported back to the US. However, before he could stand trial, he attempted to escape a prison transport and in the process got shot to death by police. However, that was not the end of Alex's story. Following his death, officers continued to investigate him and also his property, and at some point during a search of his property, they would discover all these photos of unidentified women, along with these maps where these very isolated places in New York and Pennsylvania were circled. And nobody knows what they mean. Now, police have not conclusively linked Alex to any other murders, but he does remain a suspect in several cases, and in fact, many investigators believe Alex was actually a serial killer. However, we'll probably never know how many people Alex actually killed because he took all of his secrets to the grave. At 5 p.m. on May 12, 2005, an 18-year-old college student named Simon Eng sat inside of his bedroom in the apartment he shared with his sister Sharon in New York City. Simon was supposed to be doing homework, but instead, he was doing something he loved, which was blogging. Simon would write on his blog just about every single day, and he typically wrote about his self-improvement journey he was on. Not because he thought lots of people were going to read it and be inspired by it, but because he kind of wanted to chronicle his journey so that in the future, when he was the best version of himself, he could look back and sort of see how far he had come, to see the progress he made. But on this particular day, Simon was not writing about self-improvement. Instead, he was blogging about something that was totally unusual for him. In fact, he had never written anything like this on his blog ever before. But Simon knew basically nobody read his blog, and so he wasn't really that concerned about writing something so off topic. And so at about 5:05 p.m., when he was done with this very strange blog post, He didn't think twice, he just hit post. 5 hours later, at about 10 p.m., an NYPD detective, along with some other police officers and first responders, arrived at Simon and Sharon's apartment. They went inside and went straight to Simon's bedroom, and there they would find Simon. He was laying perfectly still on the ground, his feet were bound by duct tape, and he was covered in stab wounds. They rushed up to him to feel for a pulse, but very quickly they discovered he was dead. And then before they could even process what had happened here, they heard moaning coming from the other bedroom across the hall. And so they rushed in there and they would discover Simon's sister, Sharon. She also was covered in stab wounds and laying on the ground, but she was still alive. And so they tried to rush her to the hospital to try to save her life, but in transit, she would die. And she would also die before she could actually tell authorities what happened to her and her brother. For the next 3 days, investigators could not make sense of Simon and Sharon's murders. But then a detective discovered Simon's blog, and they found his final entry. And it was that very unusual post that Simon did that was not anything to do with his self-improvement journey. Well, it would turn out that last post broke the case wide open. Right before Simon was killed, he wrote in his blog about what was actually happening in his apartment, like in real time, literally what he was seeing and hearing. Here is a screenshot of that blog post. It says, quote, "Today has been weird. At 3, some guy ringed the bell. It was my sister's former boyfriend. He is still here right now. Hopefully, he will leave soon." Sharon's former boyfriend was a man named Jin Chung Lin. And a year earlier, he and Sharon had gone through a really rocky breakup. Now, Sharon had moved on and kind of gotten over the breakup, but Jin hadn't. He was still furious about the way things ended. And so he ultimately went to Sharon and Simon's apartment to get revenge. And his revenge was murdering the brother and sister. When police confronted Jin with information from Simon's blog post, he immediately confessed to the murders. Jin was tried and found guilty of the murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Today, Simon's blog is actually still available online, so you can go and see his final post. However, what you'll really see if you go to his blog is the thousands and thousands of comments from people all around the world hoping that Simon and Sharon rest in peace. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's episode, and also remember, we have hundreds more videos for you to binge right now. But if you want a recommendation of, which video to invest your time in, well, here are 2 great options right here. If you want more Mr. Ballin content, click on this one. And if you want some redacted declassified mysteries with Luke LaManna,